Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen. Thanks very much to the listeners who took the time to send me feedback after episode 1 featuring my interview with Trent Dalton. It's my goal that each episode of Penmanship will be better than the last as I start to find my way as a podcaster, so I encourage you to keep me accountable to this goal by emailing me, andrew@penmanshippodcast.com, or catching me on Twitter @penmanshipau to let me know how you think I'm going. My guest today is Amy Remeikis, State Political Editor of Brisbane Times, which is Fairfax Media's online news outlet here in Queensland. For those who live outside of Queensland, a bit of background context. The site was established as a competitor to the Courier Mail in 2007, and Amy has been with Brisbane Times since 2012. Amy's role sees her covering Queensland's political machinations from Parliament House during sitting weeks. As a feature writer, I'm far removed from the demands of daily reporting, so I was thrilled when Amy agreed to speak with me and offer her insights into this aspect of the news media. Our interview took place in April in Amy's living room at her home in Bowen Hills in Brisbane's inner north. For someone who had been at work for the previous 12 hours, she was remarkably chipper as she sipped on a cup of peppermint tea while perched on a bench across from me. Midway through our chat, her housemate arrived, slowly and silently making her way from the front door to the kitchen while doing her best to not disturb the hardwood floors. My conversation with Amy touches on political press conference etiquette, the delicate task of performing what's known in the media business as a death knock, moving away from journalism to teach English in South Korea, Amy's Lithuanian heritage, and the emotional task of writing about her father as he slowly dies before her eyes. After our interview, Amy kindly offered to drive me home across town while doing her best not to fall asleep at the wheel. What a trooper. She's a journalist with serious skill and dedication to the task of holding Queensland's politicians to account. Introducing Amy Remeikis, State Political Editor of Brisbane Times. Here we are, it's about 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. You're at the end of your workday. I wonder if you could take us back to the beginning.
The beginning of my work today, probably much like any other day. I headed into work for about 7:30, had a couple of meetings with some contacts just to get a bit of an overview of what's happening in the political landscape. Headed into a news conference at Brisbane Times where I work at 9:30. Just gave my editors a rundown of what was happening and what stories I was looking at, and then spent the rest of the day either in interviews or meeting people or heading to press conferences. I'm an online journalist, so I write stories as I go, but then also have to plan for the next day and write, what's coming up. So yeah, probably finished work at about half an hour ago, which is actually pretty good for me.
Really? That's a 12-hour day.
Yeah, that's about standard.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say most journalists actually working in online or print are doing about that. It's constant now, so there's no sort of lull in the day, and given that a lot of what we like to call the trash comes out at about 4 o'clock, it can keep you back. It's not unusual for me to be finishing work at about 9 p.m.
Whoa, what's the trash?
Trash is what we kind of label the stuff that people don't particularly want to have to tell you about, but kind of have an obligation to. So you'll find, usually it happens on a Friday at about 4 o'clock, you'll find that that's when the police will tell you about officers that have been stood down, or the CCC will tell you about an investigation that's gone nowhere, or politicians will tell you about something that's coming up that they don't particularly want a lot of coverage about.
Can you anticipate trash?
No, not really. Sometimes you know that it's coming, or it's at least on the horizon, but you don't actually know when they're going to take it out. 4 o'clock on Friday is a particular favourite because most people are winding down for the weekend. It also means the TV networks who go to air at about 5 or 6 don't have a lot of time to put something together. And at least in this media landscape, in Queensland and probably Australia-wide, a lot of stock is still put in the 6 o'clock news. So the later that they can take out the trash, the better, because it means that all those people sitting down to watch the 6 p.m. news probably aren't going to get a huge amount of it.
Right. So it's a well-known communication strategy to do that. Do you ever speak to the people who put out the trash, as it were, about this strategy?
Yeah, I'd say that. Yeah, we do, and it's a joke among journalists in the media pack, like, oh, they're taking the trash out, or thought we were going to get away with it today, but nope, here's the trash right on time. And you do talk about it with the PRs, those who have a sense of humour, or at least a little bit of distance or space, and sort of know that that's exactly what they're doing, will sort of wryly acknowledge it, never on the record, of course, but there's a little bit of a, okay, those who take their jobs a bit too seriously will tell you that it just happened to be timing, and there's absolutely nothing to it other than that.
Is that kind of thing the bane of your existence as a reporter, or it could be worse? There are worse things.
Yeah, it could be worse. What's worse than taking out the trash is not taking it out at all, or trying to pretend that something's not happening when it's very obvious that it is. I think that hiding the truth or attempting to pervert the truth coming out is a lot worse than coming up with the best strategy to let people know about it.
12-hour workday. What's your caffeine consumption like?
Actually, I'm pretty good with coffee. I think 'cause I used to work in hospitality, which is probably why I'm at least a little more skilled at talking to people than those outside the industry. There's nothing like dealing with people when you're wearing an apron or behind a counter and seeing what can sometimes be the worst of humanity, and then using those skills in your day-to-day job as a journalist. So my coffee consumption is pretty good. I cannot, however, live without tea. Not just black tea, I probably drink about 10 cups of tea a day. And I know when I don't, because I feel a lot more stressed at the end of it. You can see I'm drinking a cup of peppermint tea. I'll probably have another one right before I go to bed too.
Okay, good to know. Was today an average work day?
Yeah, today was probably a little bit slower than most. So I'm a political reporter, and we haven't had Parliament at all this month. So we've had a change of government in Queensland. We had a Conservative government previously, which would be more reformist. Anyone who was following it for the last 3 years, that would probably be very fair to say. This government, which is a Labor government, and a minority Labor government at that, have come in with more of a consultative agenda. So they're a lot slower in what they're doing, and they're also a lot slower in telling people what they're doing. Everything is being reviewed, which for political journalists means that our day-to-day, the bread and butter political news has also slowed down quite a bit.
How much of your work is reactionary and therefore unpredictable?
I was asked this question today, actually. I would probably say it's about 60% reactionary and 40% proactive, or you're uncovering something. And that's just the nature of the job. If you're having to report on the going-ons of what's happening, it doesn't leave a lot of time to reveal or investigate other things behind it. But I try to stay ahead of that by just being across my brief and thinking about, I've got a particular interest in social justice issues, thinking about what is not being addressed. So I'll work to hit up the politicians or my contacts about issues in Queensland which are not on the legislative agenda and perhaps should be. But politicians are adept at trying to set the agenda, and they have an army of staff whose job is to help them do that. So you'll go to a press conference, they'll speak about whatever issue it is that they want to speak about, be it a train station opening or nurses being awarded 2.2% more in their pay, or if you're with the opposition, what the government has done wrong that day, what the government is going to do wrong in the future. So it's your job to say, hey, this is happening, but then also hit them up with questions to be more proactive and sort of shift the agenda from what they're trying to establish.
Are you happy with that 60-40 split?
I would love it to be more proactive, but I just think given the way that the political landscape is, and given how politics has sort of changed over the last 10 years, we have a lot more, I suppose, presidential style. We're sort of mirroring what's happening in the United States a lot more, where they sort of come out and say, here are the issues, and the agenda sort of gets hijacked, or a scandal will hijack the agenda. And that's what the audience wants to know about, read about, hear about. And my job is to provide the audience with that. But then I also think it's our job to sort of tell the audience what's happening behind the scenes, or here's an issue that perhaps you haven't heard a lot about, but you might be interested in hearing.
Right. Tell me about press conference etiquette. How do you behave at a press conference? I'm asking because I've never been to one.
Yeah, I may not be the best person to ask, because I've been told by several people that I'm quite unprofessional in the press conference environment, and that's because I've got a pretty low tolerance for bullshit. So politicians, and I've covered police rounds before, and I've covered court, and each sort of press conference etiquette is different. When it comes to police, there's not a lot that they can say, because it's usually an ongoing investigation, or it's usually a tragedy, and they still need to alert people, alert family members and things, and that's sort of an area where you don't want to stomp on. People have a right to know what's happened to their family before the public has a right to know what's happened to their family. So the etiquette there is you sort of let police officers rattle off, and you try to stop them talking in such police speak, so people can actually understand what they're talking about. When it comes to court, again, there's not a lot that lawyers or defendants are going to say when they come out. So those scenarios are more sort of listening. When it comes to politics, there's a bit more of that to and fro that I think people would expect to see in a press conference if they ever imagined what one would look like. And I will tend to let the politician have their spiel. So they'll turn up, they'll say, thanks for coming today, I want to talk about XYZ. We stand back and we listen for a few minutes. If anyone else wants to have a say on XYZ, they do. Then usually it's considered polite to ask a couple of questions about XYZ, and then you turn the press conference into what you actually want to know about, which is the scandals or some other reports that may have emerged that day, or something that has been left over from the day before. They have lines that are prepared, so they have media advisors who will go through all of the issues. They will provide talking points or lines to the politicians to say. So the Premier's office, or whoever it may be, will dictate, here is the angle that we're going to take on this, and you know that that's happening because you ask 4 different politicians and they parrot for 4 different lines which say exactly the same thing to you. And I tend to get a little bit annoyed by that, so I will cut them off usually around the 3rd time that they're not answering the question. So people who may have been following the election campaign in Queensland would have seen that ABC 24 and Sky News went live with quite a few press conferences. They probably would have seen quite a few arguments that I was having with politicians within those press conferences. And we're not doing it to argue or to show that we're smarter than them, or even to see that, to allow the public to see that, you know, we do argue. We're not doing it for that. You're doing it because you get really frustrated at not getting an answer to your question. And it's not journalists asking these questions usually. It's not because, you know, we wake up and we decide to be contrary and we decide to, you know, take down a politician. We do it because we're charged by the public, really, to find out the truth for them, because they don't have the access that we do. It's quite a privilege and an honour to be a journalist, because we do have access that the average person in the public doesn't. They can ask for an interview or an appointment with their MP, but they don't get the opportunity to say, why are you doing this, and we think this is wrong, and can you explain your actions? That's the job they've charged us with. So that's why I will argue with a politician, or I will interrupt them when I don't think that they're being honest, and I will try and get an answer from them. And because that's already happening, I do also tend to roll my eyes or sigh quite loudly or let my frustrations be known. And that, strictly speaking, is probably against press conference etiquette.
Have you ever been in trouble for this? Have you ever been spoken to by politicians or advisors or anyone in that sphere?
Yeah, and I'm not sure there's been a political journalist who's on the round daily who hasn't been spoken to either by a politician or by a press secretary after a press conference. We're humans, and we all have our issues, and journalists, as you would know, can become quite invested in a story, and the public might not believe that we do, or, you know, they might believe that we're just being fed these lines and we believe it, or that we have a particular bias. By and large, that's not true. I don't know biased journalists who go in to make someone look, you know, stupid, or to make someone look in the best light possible. Sometimes I think people can mistake the treatment of a story, like headlines or photos and something, for bias, when the story itself is usually quite pure. It's usually, you compare stories, they're usually pretty much the same. This is what happened today. So we don't go in there to make them look stupid, but sometimes when you are invested in an issue, or you've been trying to get an answer for days, and a lot of the time in this round, issues do go on for days, you become frustrated. But so do the politicians. So, because their job, as they believe it, is to govern, but then it's also they also have a responsibility to their party. So they will stick by the party line. And so they become frustrated that you don't believe them, and you're becoming frustrated because you don't believe that they're telling you the truth. And all of us being human, tempers do tend to overflow at times.
You mentioned that the current political environment is so media managed. There's lines prepared each morning, talking points. Do you enjoy the challenge of trying to get them out of that rut, out of the mechanical delivery of certain topics?
I do. I think I enjoy that challenge as much as the politicians I'm speaking to enjoy the challenge of not moving off the talking points or evading a journalist's questions, because politics, not policy, but politics is theatre. So I think somebody said at some point that politics is theatre for ugly people, because it is just acting. They play a role, and the politician in front of the microphone can be very different to the politician behind or away from the microphone.
Yeah.
So we do play a role in that, you know, at times you can be cheeky, and it does become a bit of a challenge to get them to stray off the talking point, or at least, you know, get them to break. And you usually can tell if they have, or they're close to it, because they'll call you by name, which is very rare, because when we're interviewing politicians, they're by the large not looking at you. They're staring down the barrel of a camera, or they're staring at a media advisor who's out of sight to give them an eye line. Because that way that when they're on the 6 o'clock news, they can appear to at least be looking directly at the viewer. So if a politician breaks from that and looks to the side, or if they call a journalist by their name, you can feel a little modicum of satisfaction that you've managed to sort of break them to the point where they're expressing a frustration in front of a camera.
You mentioned we at a press conference. Who is we?
So each city usually has round reporters. So there'll be your police round reporters, court round reporters, general news, council, politics, science, environment. And so each round has the same journalists who turn up time and time again. And often you can see journalists from competing publications and competing networks more often than you see your own colleagues, because you're constantly out and about. So even though you're competing, you form a bond. Political journalists sort of take that one step further, and most states and Canberra have a media gallery, which is, you have to be admitted to it. It's its own sort of entity. So the media gallery in Queensland, it has a bank account where it awards scholarships to other journalists. It runs lunches, a media club in conjunction with a partner where politicians come and speak, and members of the business community can, come and listen to that speech, and we report on what's being said. It acts within the parliament, so with the last government, the rules which govern where we can be in parliament were changed. So we can report on anything that happens in parliament. We sit in a little area which is separate to the public gallery but on the same level as the public gallery. So we can sit there and we can listen and report on anything that happens in the chamber. However, we can't harass members, so the members of parliament, in certain areas. We can't interview them in the canteen. We can't do interviews as they're heading into party room. We can see them and we can try and grab them and have a private chat, but we can't do little, ambush them, I suppose, because parliament is a place of the business of governing, and they should be safe to walk around without a journalist jumping out from behind a pot plant. So the last government, though, sort of made those rules a bit stricter in that they removed cameras from the floor of the parliament, the TV cameras, and so everyone had to rely on the lower quality webcam that was put out, which of course means that TV news networks can't use as much of that. Because it's a lower quality and it's a lot harder to stream. So that changed. Where we could go and interview people was also changed. There's lines and carpet, and they're just normal lines where carpet joins up, but effectively they became barriers. So it'd be quite comical if anyone happened to be walking past, but they have party room meetings, or Labor has their caucus meeting. So the Monday before Parliament would sit, they would all, file into their meeting, and we would be huddled. There'd be about 5 cameras and 12 or more journalists huddled together, quite crammed, behind this invisible line where the carpet joined, sort of going, do you have anything to say, as these people just ignored us. And it became a barrier where we even felt like we couldn't step beyond that line, because the Speaker of the Parliament could quite rightly kick us out for breaking the rules. So that was interesting, I suppose. But the media gallery, that's when they came together to negotiate with Parliament about what we could do to publicly state our displeasure at having been put under these new restrictions. So I suppose we're a tight group because we do see each other more. So I see the parliamentary reporters for the ABC and 4BC and the Courier Mail and the TV networks and AAP a lot more than I see my colleagues at Brisbane Times. We're at the same press conferences together. We're at Parliament, where we basically live on top of each other for 3 days of the week, and we're literally living on top of each other. We're in an open plan office where we can hear everything and yell out at each other, and you know, we share chocolates and lollies, and there's nothing that bonds journalists like sugar. And then we end up sort of socialising together, just as the press gallery, when somebody leaves the press gallery, or, you know, a Christmas party. And I suppose you start to feel that no other journalists are understanding your particular struggle better than the ones who are having the particular struggle, and that is the same for the police, court, council, and the political journalists. So when I say we, I'm talking about the press pack that I mix most with, which in my case happens to be the Parliamentary Media Gallery.
Are they welcoming of new reporters who are part of the press gallery, or is it like an initiation ceremony you have to pass?
It's not so much an initiation ceremony, but I would say that there is a pecking order. So the people who have been there the longest, and I suppose that's like school too. If you're the new kid in school, everyone sort of expects you to sort of prove your worth, or, you know, show what you've got before you can be truly considered a member, or, you know, part of the cool club. So when I arrived, it was Spencer Jolly, who had been a veteran of the press gallery for decades, the most respected member there, I suppose. Then there was also Kathy Border, Chris O'Brien, and Patrick Condren. And between them, just so much history of political reporting. And you can't help as a journalist but respect that, respect the people who have gone the hard yards, government after government after government. And that is a difficult thing, because every 3 years we have new members to deal with. In this particular case, this is the second government that I'm covering, and I've only been doing political reporting for 2.5 years. So you do respect those who have been through the change of premiers, change of members, change of scandals. So there is a pecking order. There's been a lot of change in the media landscape, in Queensland particularly. There's been a lot of redundancies. Network 10 were hit pretty hard. Fairfax has been no exception, and that brought about changes too. So if you speak to the older hacks within the media gallery, there used to be a lot more who were members of the press gallery, and now basically each network has one reporter when perhaps they would have two. So yeah, there is a pecking order, but everyone is kind of accepted pretty quickly. You just sort of, well, when I arrived at least, I felt that I had to wait for the more senior members of the media gallery to ask their questions before I could ask mine. Once you become more comfortable, you still let that happen, but you jump in maybe a little bit quicker than you would have than when you first arrived.
Does that pecking order extend to where you sit in the room?
No, it doesn't go that far, but the TVs do have the best offices by far. They're on a different level to us poor people in print and radio. They have individual offices, allegedly so they can have edit suites and all the rest of it. I think it's because they just think they're a bit more fancier than the rest of us. So they've got individual offices, and so upstairs, on the same level as the public gallery where we can view Parliament, you've got the ABC radio journalist, you have the 4BC radio journalist, you have AAP, you have the Courier Mail, the Australian, APN, which is regional media, and you have us, Brisbane Times. And we all share an office which I think was built in the 40s or 50s, judging by the furniture. And you've got it's open plan, but you've got little dividers between you. But it does mean that there's a lot of phone calls taken in the hallway, trying to get away from each other. There's been times when I've had to take a call from a contact, and I've been walking the hallway, and at one end has been the Courier Mail journalist, and at the other end is the Australian journalist. I've gone around the corner and there's another journalist, and so you end up hiding in the most ridiculous areas to sort of speak to people. But on the whole, we get along fairly well. We're pretty competitive, but when somebody gets a good story, we acknowledge the fact that, you know, that's a good story, and you'll congratulate the journalist. Also be fairly annoyed that you didn't get it, but that just makes you a little bit more competitive to get something the next time.
What are the essential tools of a daily news journalist? What do you carry with you?
I carry a notebook and a pen. I would be completely lost without that, and my phone, which is my life now. It's basically my office. And I do most of my recordings on my phone, but I'm also very paranoid of losing them, so I also record as a backup on a dictaphone, and I have an iPad which I'll file from immediately. So depending on the story, I might file some copy while I'm within the press conference and send that back to the office and update it once it's all over. But basically I sit there and I time code. I now have a nifty little pen, which is my baby, which time codes as it records, so I can point on a page to a particular place and it will take me there to that point on my iPad.
Wow.
Which cuts down, a couple of maybe 30 seconds in terms of trying to find that exact point that I'm after for the quote. But when you're in an online environment, 30 seconds can be the difference between getting it up first and getting it up once, it's already being shown to be on the Courier Mail or APN or already on a radio bulletin.
Where did you come across this pen?
I came across, I think it was I was reading something about an American journalist, and they were talking about tools that make their job easier. And they mentioned this pen, and then I did some research and waited for it to sort of catch up, I suppose, to what I needed. And then the technology seemed to get there, and I bought it, and it was amazing.
What's it called?
A Live Scribe.
Sounds awesome. I might have to check it out.
Yeah, I'll show it to you afterwards.
Would you recommend it for someone like myself, a feature journalist?
If you're doing long form interviews, in which case you need to get to a particular point. The Live Scribe, it's not an ad, they do not pay me, I promise. I had to pay for it like everyone else.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing because I can write notes on the note paper and it will convert it to text. So it's pretty, it not only is, you've got your phone or iPad recording the interview, you Bluetooth it up so that it's connected, you're taking notes, but then I can also take notes and have those converted to text immediately. And it's fairly accurate once it understands your handwriting. And then I can just send that to the office. So during the election campaign, which was held in January, we had to report a lot quite quickly. My work was running a live blog, which was very well read. Just here's an update of everything that was happening. And a lot of my entries came from this pen converting to text and sending on, which meant that I didn't have to think about it. I could write down a funny observation or a note or what I wanted to say to the public about what was happening in front of me. And and it's probably, my age as well, I still find it quite intimate to handwrite things rather than just type. Immediately, probably more natural flow, I suppose, those thoughts that come to you, I find it easier to write them down. So having something that can convert that to text and I can send on to work has been a revelation for me.
Did you ever learn shorthand or try to learn?
I did try to learn it, but I'm terrible at languages, and that includes T-line and Pitman. So I know a few bits, but they don't teach it at universities, and I think that they should, because that's probably the time as a journalist that you have to learn shorthand. They did try to teach me at my first job at the Sunshine Coast Daily, but I was always too busy to make it to the lessons, because when you're a working journalist, most of hours are taken up with an interview or writing or something. It's not like you can go, I will always be free between 10 and 11 on a Wednesday. You don't know what will happen. So I've just never had the opportunity to learn it, and it does seem to be the thing that you can't teach yourself. You do need to have someone to teach you. And from what I've found, shorthand teachers are in very short supply. I suppose it's a dying skill, but there's a couple of journalists within the press pack who do have it, and I'm very envious of them. I watch them write very, very quickly, and I'm like, damn it, I wish I could do that. But I suppose as technology moves on, it becomes less and less of an issue. Like I said, now, I've got a pen that converts something to text, which means that I can be just as quick. But when you're sitting down after an interview that has gone for 25 minutes, and most press conferences do go for that amount of time, it would be handy if you had full quotes written out. It'd give you a better idea of what you want to say in the story, sort of straight up. And sometimes having to go back through a tape and listen for what you want can sort of rob you of the emotion that you felt, or the points that you thought needed to be made immediately as you were listening to them say it. You can jot down notes, but it becomes a little bit more difficult to have that same feeling flow through to the story. And every journalist has feelings that flow through. You're not intending on telling the reader to read it in a particular way, but you're human. You're interpreting what they're saying in a way, and that's going to come out in the story. But I always find it a lot easier to write from beginning to end if I've got a clear idea of exactly what they've said for me to slot in.
Let's rewind a bit. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Mount Gambier in South Australia, and then I moved to the Gold Coast when I was 7. And I did all my schooling there, and then moved to Brisbane after I finished high school.
Siblings?
2. I have a younger sister and a younger brother. My sister's just gone and lived my dream and gone to England. And my brother is finally worked out what he wants to do, and that's apparently law, which has upset my policeman father no end, that he's raised a journalist and a lawyer who I'm sure he considers his 2 greatest adversaries during his police career, but what are you going to do?
Did you like school? Were you a good student?
I wouldn't say I was a good student. I really enjoyed learning. I hated assessment, and I think it's stupid. It doesn't teach a child their worth. It just sort of shows how good you are at recall. And I happen to be great at recall, but in primary school I probably went along with it. In high school I began to question it more and more. I'm probably more creative, I suppose, than literal, and I didn't feel that cramming for something for a couple of hours before an exam was teaching me anything, or showing the teacher that I'd actually learnt anything. I found that it was more just proving that I could remember things on demand and then recite them. So I did struggle against that, and if you spoke to any of my high school teachers, they would tell you that I made my views on that quite clear, and that I was easily distracted and a distraction to others.
Were you good at English?
I was, and that's probably why I became a journalist. I sort of fell into it because I didn't particularly know what I wanted to do, and I think maybe I still don't know what I wanted to do, but I had a great English teacher, Mr. Robinson, who said, you're good at English, you should be a reporter. And I was like, okay, not sure what else is going on. So I finished high school and got a decent enough OP to get into the university course that I wanted, and studied journalism at QUT, where the same sort of issues that plagued me at high school plagued me at university. But I did find that I could speak to people, and I could listen well, and apparently you can make a career out of that. So so here I am. But I did have several misstarts before I sort of found my niche, I suppose, in journalism. I didn't just go, wow, this is amazing and this is what I want to do forever. I struggled to find where I belonged in the giant journalism pool. I finished I got a job in radio before I finished university, and I really struggled with that because, as your listeners may hear, I tend to say things the longer way rather than the shorter way. And when you're being told you have a 2.5 minute bulletin and you can only write one line and have a grab and that's an entire story, I struggled a lot with that. So I quit that job and went and worked in a cafe again for a couple of years. And while I was doing that, I dabbled in some television. And I was terrible at that as well because I don't have a fantastic voice and I have terrible hair and I'm very lazy, so I could not be bothered doing my makeup or any of the other things that they require from women in this industry. And again, you could only tell a story on television if you had the pictures. So I struggled with that as well. So I kind of gave television away and was told by one executive producer that perhaps I should think about PR. Journalism wasn't for me. But then I began feature writing and submitting that to the local paper, and they liked what they saw, and they brought me in for an interview, and I didn't get that particular job, but they did offer me one a couple of months later, and I'd never considered news writing. I'd been terrible at it at university because I thought, I go to QT, I'm going to be a broadcast journalist like every other journalist that goes to QT. And yeah, news writing seemed to be where I fit best.
Take a few steps back. What was your first paid job? Did you have a job as a teenager?
I did. It was working at the Carrara markets on the Gold Coast, and I worked in a place that served bacon and eggs and fried goods, and I worked the fryer, which was great for my teenage skin. There is nothing like a layer of oil to make you feel really good about yourself as a teenager.
Right. Did you enjoy it?
I enjoyed making money. It was probably the first time I, made money and was able to contribute to the household, so I enjoyed that. I earned the princely sum of $7 an hour, and I worked there from when I was 14 to when I was 17.
Right.
So it meant that I did give up a lot of weekends because it was only open on weekends, and I had to be there at about 5:30, I think, was my shift. But earning money sat very nicely with me.
Yeah, you must have been pretty keen because, like you said, giving up social aspects of weekend, that's a tough one for teenagers.
My mum was sick a lot when I was growing up, so my dad was working nights. He'd left the police force by that stage, and he was a contract cleaner. So he was working nights, and I would take care of my mum and my brother and sister while he was out. And then he would come home very early in the morning, drop us off at school, and then help take care of my mum. So money was quite tight. 5 people with, a cleaner's salary, and I suppose we're also first generation in terms of my father's side. My father and Oma escaped Lithuania during World War II, spent a lot of time in refugee camps all through Europe before eventually landing in Australia. And so we were raised in a very Eastern European style. My Oma had a lot to do with our upbringing, and she taught us a lot about responsibility and family responsibility and how you only sort of move forward if you're working together. So that weighed quite heavily on me. So being able to lift the burden from my parents in that I could now pay for my school uniforms or pay for my school trips, that I think that's the reason that I was like, well, this is just something that I need to do.
And you were the eldest child too, so I suppose you felt that sense of responsibility more keenly.
Yeah, I'm sure it's textbook, but my brother and sister picked up pretty much exactly where I left. So my sister actually took over my job at the markets when I left, and my brother also, he got a job fairly early as well. And because my parents were so proud, particularly my Lithuanian dad, we used to hide money in the couch for them to find and pretend that it just must have fallen out of their pockets. And I'm sure that they knew that's what we were doing. But it was a way for us to help without, going, we know how tough this is, and my parents having to admit that they couldn't afford to pay for everything for us, and occasionally they did need help from their kids to put money in the car and the fuel in the car and buy groceries. But they also could see how helping them also made us feel good. So it's this little game that we used to play, and then eventually they were like, okay, enough. And when we each moved out of home, and as kids do, you kind of come across financial struggles. You'd find a bill had been paid by mum and dad. Nobody ever said anything. So I suppose we all feel like we've helped each other, but we just don't really acknowledge it. It's the Remeikis way. It works better that way.
Do you feel much of a connection to Lithuania?
Yeah, I do, and it's very bizarre because I wasn't born there, but it's just my oma for, I suppose, many years didn't want to talk about what had happened to her. She lost children during the war, and as we were taught it, while World War II was going on and Hitler was doing his thing, Stalin was doing pretty much exactly the same thing in Russia and the countries, the Baltic nations that he had invaded. So there was ethnic cleansing happening there, and those people who found themselves on a list were being sent to gulags in Siberia or just being disappeared. And my oma, who was quite politically active, found herself on that list. So she only had time to escape with my father, who was her youngest child, and flee the country, and her and her siblings just fled. And it was very rough because she gave up everything that she knew, and she had been quite wealthy. Her family had been quite wealthy there, and she had been known and respected, and all of a sudden she found herself in refugee camps with a young boy, and then ended up on a boat to Australia, which I now find very amusing because my father is quite conservative and will argue against, illegal boat people, inverted commas, but that's how he came to this country.
Right.
That's how we landed here. He did not have a visa. They jumped on a boat during a war and came knocking on Australia for help, and just lucky that they landed in a much more sympathetic time, I suppose. Being white probably also helped them, but they spent time in camps in Melbourne, which they explained as having to repay the government for accepting them. And my oma used to tell a story of how she drew a circle on her front yard and put my father in it when he was young and told him to stay there while she went off to work. And she said she came back and he was always sitting there playing, and he never once ventured out of that circle, which of course Dad tells us he ran away the moment that she turned the corner, and just knew when she was coming back and would run back very quickly and just be sitting there pretending he'd spent all day in the front yard. So yeah, I do feel a connection to Lithuania in that my oma sort of one day, shortly after the USSR was disbanded, that sort of broke the seal in her, and it became very important to her that her grandchildren, which, having lost children meant that we were the last descendants of her, knew what Lithuania was about, what her life in Lithuania was about, our family history, and she passed on many traditions which I sort of carry on today without thinking. And I was that kid in a state primary school who had liverwurst and pickles and herrings and lunch, and all she ever wanted was a Vegemite sandwich, but that wasn't sort of happening. Food was where we were always very different, and I suppose that's because we show our love through food. It seems to be a very Eastern European tradition. You don't necessarily say I love you, but you will try to feed someone the moment that they enter your house. And so the food that I hated as a kid, I now find myself craving whenever I need comfort, which means that there's been a lot of late night trips for gherkins and pickled herrings and goulashes and all sorts of weird things. And potatoes, always potatoes.
Well, I will note that you are carrying on that tradition of offering food, because as soon as I arrived, you offered me some goulash.
Well, the ghost of my ancestors will eat me if I do not, Andrew. It is kind of a rule, but my dad, he's had several strokes, and he's not able to get around like he used to. But if I do ever bring somebody home, he will get out of his chair to offer somebody something to eat. And if you accept it, he will then stand over you and make sure you're enjoying it and eating it. Because if you're not, we'll have to offer you something else.
I see. Have you been to Lithuania?
I have not, no.
Okay.
No, it is absolutely on the list, but just haven't made it there yet through one reason or the other. However, my oma passed a few years ago, and we have to inter her ashes in the family tomb, so we're going to make a journey very soon.
Okay. Back to journalism. Had you written much before applying to study journalism at QT?
suppose I've written like a lot of stories, and I kept a journal, throughout my childhood years, and found it a lot easier to write my feelings. So if I ever had a fight with friends, they could expect an 8-page letter from me explaining, why the fight happened and how I felt about the fight or how much I loved them and how sorry I was. And if I had a fight with my parents, while we would yell a lot, or at least I would and my dad would, they could then also expect a 20-page letter detailing everything that had gone wrong that day and in the fight, and how I feel, and etc., etc. So looking back, I always found it easier to express emotions through writing. And then I never really struggled with word limits or writing when I was in school. Found it very easy to look at something and then be able to deconstruct that in a story or in an assignment. Still don't think that necessarily proves anything, but for me it was a lot easier to do it that way. So yeah, I did write, and I think there was a few Reader's Digest competitions or something which I would write and enter in. And same with, when I was in school, I did debating and public speaking, and it wasn't my delivery, but the fact that I could write down these arguments and then sort of say them in order meant that I did okay with that as well.
Did you enjoy the course at QUT?
I'm going to say no, and it's absolutely nothing to do with the university or my teachers, which were great, or the course. It's just, I don't think journalism is a university course. I think it's a trade. I think it's something that you learn on the job, and it's something that you learn from people who are doing it now and can teach you. I think if it is to be a university course, really it's only a year and a half worth of subjects, and the rest is just filler to make it a 3-year degree. And I became quite frustrated with that, and missed several classes and weeks and months where I just sort of didn't turn up because I didn't really understand what the point of it all was.
Right.
Yeah, having people who were journalists tell you what it's like can only go so far, I think, and the digital media environment is a great example of that, because I think you'd find it quite difficult to find anyone in a university who has worked as a digital journalist, especially since digital journalism became a medium in its own right. And you can kind of see that also with media advisors. None of them have worked in a new media environment, and so are still very much stuck on, the paper will set the agenda, so this needs to go to the paper, and the 6 o'clock news is the most watched thing, and so we need to do that. And Sundays are very important because people love to sit down on a Sunday, and all of that's changing. But the people who are sort of disseminating that information haven't worked in the industry to see that it has changed.
You graduated in 2001, so you were, I guess, on the cusp of that next wave of digital journalism, the first wave. You started working at Sunshine Coast Daily in 2005, I believe. What was that first role?
At the Daily or before
The
that?
Daily, yes.
My first role was as a feature writer, and just given regional journalism and what happens in regional papers, that quickly became a jack of all trades.
Yeah.
And then I ended up on the police desk. But the Daily actually started a digital site well ahead of its time. They had a quite forward-thinking editor who said, this is probably going to be the future and we need to be above this curve. And they sort of embraced it, and they started a digital news site, doing a lot of the things that I do now, like putting news up on that first and, bites of information. But there was a big struggle within the newsroom of paper versus digital, and there was a lot of pushback of people who were saying that the paper was being robbed, and we could only put stories on the digital site on the same day that they were in the paper. So eventually that's probably what led to its downfall, and then the company APN sort of said, newspapers can't have individual sites, we'll have sort of a blanket sort of site for all of our publications, and you can tailor it to your local audience. But it took away that personalisation that readers like, and I'm not sure if it's recovered yet. It's still not what it was when it first started, when it was ahead of the curve. It's probably now, just sitting on it. Because, and I guess that's the problem, I work for a digital-only publication, so I don't have any of that pushback. But even within Fairfax itself, if you have a newspaper attached to your digital product, you've still got a lot of people who are feeling very loyal to the newspaper and feel that online is destroying what they love the most, which is the paper. So there's still a lot of arguments and debate within newspaper offices about what can go online and when it can go online. So Australia is probably a bit behind the UK and America in terms of being digital first. A breaking news story will go up online immediately, but a big investigation will always be saved until midnight or for the next day, which is still that heritage thinking of we need to set the agenda immediately rather than, putting up something at lunchtime, because they just feel that readers will still expect to see fresh news, new news in the morning.
Did you enjoy being a jack of all trades at the Daily?
Yeah, I did, but it got tiring after a while, and then I was the police reporter, their chief police reporter, which in a country town quickly becomes the death knock reporter. And
tell me about that.
You find it's usually young journalists who don't have a lot of experience because you usually cut your teeth on the police round. And if you're in a country town, particularly death knocks, which is when you found out somebody has died in some sort of tragedy, be it crime related or road accident related, it becomes your job to go knock on the door of the family and say, tell us how you feel, which can be horrendous, particularly for people who have never had to deal with death before. And a lot of these kids who are doing it are, fresh out of uni, not a lot of coping skills, and all of a sudden they find they're on the front door of a parent who's lost a child and they're not far out of school themselves. It's a big ask that we put on young journalists. I was a little bit luckier in that I had a bit of life experience behind me by the time I had to start to do it, because I was in my early 20s, at least by then, and had been away from journalism for a little bit. But still, I remember one week where I had to do a death knock every day.
Wow.
And that starts to weigh on you. I remember everyone I've ever had to go and see. I am still in contact with quite a few of them just on Facebook, because you become part of their lives. You force your way in, and they do welcome you in that no means no. I don't know any journalist who has ever pushed beyond the initial no thank you, we don't want to talk, and that's the polite way. A lot of the times you're having things thrown at you, or dogs released, or grieving people screaming at you, which is a completely understandable reaction. But for those that do say yes please, I would like to tell their story, have them known for more than for the way they died, have people know who they were when they were part of their lives and alive, you're still coming in at a point that is people at their absolute worst, their worst memory. So I feel that I then have the responsibility not just to leave them there, and so I would check in, or in terms of journalism, we're never supposed to show who we're writing about, the story, before we publish it. It's one of those things where you're meant to say, no, this is completely my words, but I broke that for every death knock that I ever wrote, in that I would always show the parents or the friends or the wife or the husband or whoever it was the story before it would be published, because those sort of stories, they don't belong to the public and they don't belong to the publication, they belong to the family and to the loved ones. So I would break that, and I would let them have editorial control in terms of how their loved one was portrayed. And I rarely had anyone say, I would like to have this changed. but when you're writing their memories, and that is such a heavy burden and honour, that's something that you don't want to get wrong. But then because you are so emotionally invested, it does become part of you. And I think the only people who would really understand how a journalist feels in those moments are emergency service workers who have to do exactly the same thing. But they at least have the protection of being an emergency service worker, and people expect them on their doorstep when a tragedy has happened. A lot of people do not expect to see a journalist, and the journalists that they're sending don't have any idea how to deal with the situation that they're walking into. So it's quite terrible, really. Important stories that need to be told, but I think the industry needs to work out how we tell those stories and who we send to tell them.
How did you conduct yourself in those situations? What were your first words?
I would always identify myself as a journalist straight up, because it's absolutely terrible to try and hide. I would usually call first, and rather than turn up on their doorstep and just say, hello, my name is Amy Remeikis, I'm a reporter, I'm very sorry for your loss, along those lines. Would you like a tribute written? Here is how it works, and we can do this any way that you like, whether it's over the phone or I can come and see you. You will have control. That's if you manage to get it through the first through sentences. There's quite a lot of the times that the phone would just be hung up immediately. If it was particularly heinous or particularly tragic, and that always children, anything to do with children was just terrible. There were quite a few times when I said that I'd made the call and I didn't, and they didn't want to talk. Or we do what journalists say, and that's knock on the grass. So you sort of have a complicit agreement with the photographer that you've been sent out, that you will drive out there and then say nobody was home, and then drive back. Most editors know that this is happening, but I guess it's a game that you play, and that, yeah, those ones you kind of did when it was just, you knew that it was too fresh. The police had told you that it was just, too awful. As I did more of the police round and developed relationships with police officers, particularly those in the forensic crash unit, who were often first on scene, I would begin to ask them to sort of make the approach, not in a professional, or hi, I'm a police officer and this journalist would like to call you, more in a way of if it was coming up with what they can expect. And police often do that. Like, they will be counselling people who have lost loved ones of, this is what happens, and people have a lot of questions like, will the media be coming, and what can I expect, and am I going to have cameras parked on my front lawn? And when that was brought up, the police officers who I knew would just say, they can be, however, if you would like to speak to a journalist, I can put you into contact with one, or if you would like to say no media, I can let them all know not to call you. So you do tend to work a lot with your police contacts, and it really is to save these people more grief. But the worst one I ever did was when I'd arrived at a house. I hadn't been able to get to contact them with the phone, and for whatever reason my editor was very, very strict on, we really want you to go get this story. And I arrived at the house, and the young man's cousins were turning up at the house, and I was there in a news car so they could see that I was a journalist, and they just returned from a camping trip, and they were like, oh hey, can we help you? And I was like, oh, I just, I was here to talk to blah blah, but I'll go now on call. And they were like, well, why are you here? And I was just stuck. They obviously knew something terrible had happened. I didn't want to be the one to tell them. So I was like, I think you just need to talk to these people. I need to go now. And then they just started yelling at me like, who is it? And yelling names out at me of their family. And and I was in tears and they were in tears, and it was just, I will never forget that, having been the person at that rawest form of grief, having to be the person who had to tell them about it. But then there were others, a family whose wife and mother went to work as a cleaner, and a big industrial gate fell on her because the company or the particular gate company hadn't adjusted something, and so she was crushed to death, and it was terrible. And that family were amazing in that afternoon, and it was the first one I ever did, and they invited me into their house and sat me on their back deck and showed me photos of Kathy, the woman, and told me all these stories about her, and kept checking that I was okay, because I was obviously a novice. And I kept saying, I can't understand how you're asking me if I'm okay. And we stayed in contact, for years. And so you do form those relationships as well, but it is a terrible, terrible part of the job, and it's why I'm so glad to be in politics and not police rounds, because eventually you get burnt out. I did it consistently for 4.5 years at the Daily, and I quit journalism and went travelling, and a large part of it was because I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't see any more death, and I couldn't speak to people about death anymore.
Fair enough. You went and taught English in Seoul.
I did, yeah. Went and hung out with some kids to try to get away with everything. It had been a particularly traumatic crime scene, and I was one of the first on scene. And it was terrible, and the smells were terrible, and the sights were terrible, and usually you're protected by a wave of emergency services, and I'd gotten there so early that because, tow truck drivers and a whole bunch of people will tell police reporters what's happening, and I didn't realise what I was walking into, or I would never have gone on that close. It was 2 young men who were racing down the Bruce Highway, and they hit they hit a truck at such speeds that the passenger was severely injured immediately, and then the car just blew up. So I arrived while it was still on fire. And even though I was still some distance away, it was still terrible, and there was just debris and just awful things on the road, and I think something kind of snapped in me that night, and I just was like, I can't do this anymore and stay human, because I felt, and I still do, I felt every single death quite deeply, and it quite impacted me. So I'm probably one of the safest drivers in that you will never see me texting or doing anything like that, because I've seen what happens on the other end. So I quit and just said...
Immediately?
A couple of weeks after, work had sent me to counselling, and while I was there I just sort of came to the realisation that I just couldn't do it anymore and retain the sort of person that I wanted to be. So I put in my resignation, and they said, what are you going to do? And I was like, I have no idea. And the global financial crisis had just happened, because my original plan was to go to England, and I couldn't do that. So then I looked at Ireland, and I couldn't do that. And I looked at Dubai, and then their economy collapsed, and Japan, and the same thing happened, and eventually settled on Korea and got a job with the public school system, and went to Seoul, and I taught primary school kids English, and it was fantastic.
Do you think you brought any skills to that job from journalism?
Definitely, in terms of being able to identify students who were sort of falling behind a little bit, or who couldn't understand you. There's a look that just translates into any country or language where people have no idea what you're talking about. But also in terms of, picking out those kids who are a bit more cheeky, or a bit, who wanted a little bit more from you. It also helped with diplomacy, because anyone who's ever worked in a Asian country knows that there's several levels of bureaucracy that you need to work through. So if I wanted a day off, I had to get permission from my co-teacher and my year coordinator and my homeroom person, and then the head of department, and then each vice principal, and then the principal of the school, so nobody felt dishonoured that they hadn't been asked.
Wow.
So that was kind of a big deal, when you're used to just being able to say, oh, I can't come in on this day, I've got an appointment. and so it did help with diplomacy. And I think the greatest gift I gave those kids was an Australian accent. You had to kind of pretend to talk in an American accent or they wouldn't understand you. And my school that I was sent to was on the poorer end of Seoul, so on the outskirts. And they'd never met an Australian before, and neither had the teachers. And so to prepare for my arrival, the teachers all watched Crocodile Dundee and then became terrified that I would be turning up with this massive ochre accent which they couldn't understand. So my co-teacher who arrived, and they pick you up like little puppies at the pound. You're taken to after your orientation, you're taken to a car park, and they come and they're like, "Is one of you Amy?" And then you're like, "That's me," and you get in your car and wave goodbye to people you're never going to see again. She was like, "Oh, how are you?" And I said, "Oh, very well, and nice to meet you," and some rudimentary Korean greeting that I'm sure I pronounced wrong. And then she went, "Oh, thank God I can understand you." And she'd lived in America for quite a long time, so her English was quite good. And I said, "Oh, what do you mean? I'm here to teach English." And she said, "Oh, we watched Crocodile Dundee and we could not understand anything, and we thought, why is the government sending us someone who does not speak English? So everyone will be so happy." And then she proceeded to say, "G'day, mate." And I was like, okay, yep, good, that's your Australian influence. So when I taught the kids, I would have to say soccer instead of soccer, and little changes like that. But I was walking up the hallway. One day I'd had to duck out of the lesson for 2 seconds to do something. And they were reciting days of the week, these little grade ones. And as I was coming up the hallway, I could hear them saying Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And I was like, "Oh, passed on a little bit of Australia to these little kids, and they'll probably never forget it."
I'm sure they won't.
I hope not.
Did you go there by yourself?
My best friend ended up coming along as well. She's also another journalist, but she reached a similar point for different reasons of wanting to see part of the world. So we jumped together, which was really nice, having somebody reassure you that you're making the right decision, because it's a big deal leaving the only career that you've ever known. And journalists in particular don't actually have a lot of marketable skills when you break it down. We can talk to people and we can listen and we can write things, but then so can everyone else. So in terms of thinking, "Oh God, what am I going to do?" it can be quite scary. So having her there was fantastic, and I probably wouldn't have lasted the first few months without it. But it also taught me a lot, just living in a country that didn't speak English, about human nature and communication, and how we all have sort of the same concerns and the same worries. We just sort of express them in different ways, and that maybe as a native English speaker, you don't have to rely on those non-verbals that often, but those non-verbals can sort of show you so much. So living in a place where I was entirely reliant on non-verbals for a good year to get by has taught me a lot, now that I'm back being a journalist, about how to actually work out what somebody is saying despite what words might be coming out of their mouth.
During that time in Korea, did you disconnect from the news?
I did, absolutely. And I think you just begin to consume news in a completely different way. So at first I couldn't let go, and I was checking every news website for information about back home, and looking up just local areas. So I was reading areas that I knew, so Brisbane, Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast news, and then I was reading wider, and I just was trying to talk to people and going, "Oh God, this is happening." But I was talking primarily to either Koreans or Americans or British people who just didn't give a shit what was happening in Australia. Couldn't point out Queensland on a map if you put a gun to their head, and had no idea about any of the politicians that we were talking about. So while I was away was when the Gillard government came to power in a hung parliament, and Australia was without a prime minister. And I was looking on Facebook, and this is when I realised how disconnected from the news I had become, because my entire Facebook feed was just full of people complaining about the political situation in Australia, and I had not heard a single peep about it at all outside of that. None of my conversations were about that. No, even my friend Blythe, when we were talking about it, it was more of a, hey, that's weird. So back home doesn't have a prime minister. Bizarre. But it just wasn't, whereas, you know, a year before we would have been like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah. New story of the decade.
Yeah, but then, you know, when North Korea is pointing missiles at you, you tend to change your perspective on what a, you know, amazing news story actually is.
Indeed. You were there until 2011, and there was a time in there where you freelanced for a while. What were you freelancing? What were you writing?
I was writing about what was happening in Korea that people may not know of and thought was interesting. I was having to do it under a pseudonym because your visa requirements are quite strict in Korea, and you can't work for anything else if you're, you know, hired by the government, which I suppose is usual. But one of the stories that I wrote was about single mothers in Korea, which is a massive taboo, which for an industrialized nation you wouldn't even think was happening. But these women were having to hide the fact that they were single mothers because their culture was so against it. So I was talking to women who had made up husbands and wedding rings and whole backstories for these husbands and fathers that didn't exist, but then were being found out by landlords who were snooping and going through their mail and discovering that, you know, their life was a lie and that there was no husband working away from home or whatever, and then kicking them out on the street because they weren't going to have a single mother polluting their building, or women who had been disowned by their families for having a child out of wedlock, or women who quite recently had been taken to particular facilities to give birth, which are set up for women who don't have partners, and then being basically badgered into giving up their child for adoption, which is something that's quite alien. So I did things like that, and yeah, mainly concentrated on having a break away from journalism though, which I think every journalist should do every few years.
Broad question, why do you think people talk to journalists?
That's a very good question. I think partly they talk to journalists because they're conditioned to. They're conditioned to think of a journalist as somebody who's hopefully trustworthy. Cynically, they'll say that they won't, but I'd say that the public does have trust in journalists not to reveal sources and to want to tell them what's happening. So I'd say partly because they're conditioned, and also partly because people who survive in this industry, you know, and you are a great example of that, also being freelance, which is, I think, a much harder job than what I've got, being attached to a publication, is that you survive because you're good at listening to people, which is your job. Above everything else, your job is to listen to people, to hear what they're saying, and then act as that conduit to tell people what, you know, who need to know what these people are saying. Like, journalists aren't amazing, and we don't do amazing things. We're usually writing or talking about people who do, and passing on that information. So I do sort of see journalism as more of an information channel. We have the resources and the ability and the access to investigate and to ask the questions and to share these stories. I mean, back in the day, we would have been walking from town to town with a trumpet, you know, telling the news from what was happening like 20 kilometres away for our supper. Like that's still our job. And the people who manage to make a career that goes beyond the first few years, and it's amazing how many people you went to uni with who don't end up being journalists, or who drop out or go earn a lot more money in PR and communications. The people who stick with it want to tell stories, and they're good at listening to people, and I think people who tell them those stories can sort of recognise that.
Great answer.
It's a tough question.
Getting towards the end, you wrote a story last March, that was quite outside your daily routine of political reporting. It was about your father.
Mm.
Tell me about that story. How would you describe it to someone who hadn't read it?
Yeah, I try to shy away from writing personal things because, once again, I'm not sure if readers care about me or my life, and I deliberately have a terrible photo of myself that goes with my byline, so I'm not recognised when I'm walking around, because it doesn't so much matter that I wrote it. I find that the story matters a lot more than a byline. And I suppose most people would be able to tell you about a story, but they wouldn't be able to tell you who wrote it or even what news medium they found it on. So I do tend to shy away from that sort of thing. But my father, he's had a few strokes and he's dying. Doctors tell us that he's dying. Dad knows that he's dying, and we talk about it quite openly. And I suppose that, once again, is being Eastern European, death is dealt with much more pragmatically than I suppose it is for a lot of other Anglo families. And the more that I was sort of talking to people about what was happening within my family, the more I saw people were sort of shutting off the moment that I mentioned Dad was going to die, that we'd been told we were dealing with a set amount of time. We don't know how much time, but that we should start counting the days. Because I don't think people know how to deal with death or have the conversation of death. And people wanted to be able to express their sympathy to me, but also thought that the best way to help me was to not talk about it. And for me, it's the biggest thing going on in my life. The fact that, the man who raised me eventually I'm going to live in a world where he doesn't exist anymore. So after talking about it with my family, I once again expressed it the only way that I know how, which is the written words. And I wrote the story in about 15 minutes. And it basically is just how I and my family are coping with the news that my dad is dying. And it got a tremendous reaction when it was put up, and much more than I thought would happen. I thought, some people would read it and say, oh, that's very nice and we're very sorry for you, Amy. But the amount of people who emailed me, who called, who sat down and wrote me letters to say that this was happening to them and they didn't know how to broach the subject, and thank you for sharing your story because it makes them feel a little less alone in the world. It touched me, and I stayed in contact with one woman who was apart from her father, who was dying on the other side of the world, and we would just have email conversations about what it was like to know that your dad was dying, and how you dealt with your family. And her father passed on, and she I suppose that was the conclusion of our contact. She felt that she'd gotten what she needed, which was somebody to listen to her. But yeah, it really came from that. I really thought we needed to sort of spark the conversation about death. We talk a lot about people when they're alive, and when somebody has passed on, we talk a lot about that as well, and people are quite happy to sit down and listen to your memories, but we don't talk about the dying process, which for anyone going through it is the only thing that matters in their life.
Yeah, I went back and read it again today, and I looked through the comments again, and it was remarkable to see the response. And one of the commenters said that they called their dad for a chat and they're catching up that weekend. I'm sure you, through that piece, helped many of those connections or reconnections to help. It's a great example of the power of the written word, I suppose.
Yeah, I hope so, because it does have a lot of power, and sometimes we can forget that. So it's nice to have a reminder that we are making a difference, however small that is. But selfishly, it also helped my family and I. My dad was quite chuffed to find himself being written about. And it helped my brother and sister, I suppose. All of us understand that while we do talk about it, we're also feeling emotions that are very similar, that are hard to put into words. And since I wrote that piece, my dad he's gone downhill quite a bit, and just watching watching that happen and feeling so helpless, it never goes away. Like it colours every single day. I wake up and I know that this is happening, and that this might be the day that I get the phone call that he's no longer going to be here. But it's such a human thing that happens to everyone. Everyone is going to lose someone. We just maybe need to talk about that process of what it's like to lose someone a little more, just to make it a little easier.
Was it tough to convince your editors to run a personal story like that?
To be honest, my editor was a little like, this is, we shouldn't be running vanity pieces. But once he read it, he said, okay, I understand. I guess it's hard to know what a piece is going to be like until you actually read it. And when you have a journalist turn up and say, I'm going to write about my dad dying, they can kind of go, well, what form is that going to take, and what good is this going to do our audience, which is who we serve. But there was absolutely no question once they read it about it being run.
Yeah, there was one line in particular which struck me then and still strikes me as incredibly powerful. Every time I see him, I try and file away a piece of his heart, but end up losing a piece of my own. You wrote it in 15 minutes. What was that emotion that was driving that writing?
I think that line is probably, it just popped into my head when I was seeing my dad, and we were just sitting across at each other from the table, and I've become obsessed with getting as much information from him about his life as possible. And I suppose that is the journalist in me. I feel that if I can record his story, then I can keep him alive forever in some form. So I have become obsessed with that, and he was telling me some ridiculous story from his police years about how him and his partner went out to a farm in the middle of Northern Territory because there'd been cattle that had been rustled, and so they were talking to farmers around the place, and they saw some cattle tracks on the ground, and my dad apparently went to his partner and he was like, oh, don't you reckon that looks like the tracks of the cattle that we're missing? And the farmer's apparently gone, you've got me. Yep, it's been me. And my dad was like, oh, that's just bullshitting. I don't know, I can't tell a cow from another cow. So he's like, yeah, and I arrested him and I solved the case, and it was just me going, ah. And he was laughing while he was telling this story. And I was just looking at him, recording it and making a note to record that was the point that he laughed. And I had his laughter on tape. And I just remember thinking that I'm so desperate to sort of file him away, but I feel, and I'm getting emotional even thinking about it, I feel that each time that I'm having a conversation that instead I'm just trying to shove all of my love at him and file myself away with him, I suppose. Ugh, I hate crying. I'm sorry. But yeah, I suppose that's where it comes from, because dying is a selfish process for loved ones, because I think you do try to make it about you, because they're going, and it is a very personal thing that's happening to you. And of course you remember that they're in pain, and of course you remember that this is something that's happening to them, but you can't help but feel that this is actually happening to you, and that you need to control it in somehow, which is, while I'll keep my dad talking a lot longer than I probably should because he's tired and he needs to rest, and I'll try and force more conversation from him, because it's become me trying to get as much of him as possible. And that's the other reason that I wrote the piece, because sometimes we do need to remember that it isn't actually about us. It's about what's happening to them, and we need to respect however they get through it. And for my dad, that's talking a lot about euthanasia and what he would like to happen, which is very difficult and confronting, especially for a daughter to hear that their father has reached the point where they don't want to live anymore. And I'm not sure that Dad is quite there yet, but I do feel that he's rapidly approaching that point. And selfishly, I can't even imagine that, and argue very intently against it and point out everything that he'd be missing, grandchildren, my brother and sister getting married, if that's what they decide to do. But for him, he's in a lot of pain, and every day that goes by shows one more thing that he can't do that he used to be able to. I can't empathise with that because I can't understand what that would be like, but for him, he's losing a little bit of himself every day, and I can rationally understand how you would not want to lose all of yourself. You'd want one last piece of control. But that's just, one more confronting conversation that I suppose is somewhere in our future, and another argument to have during this process. But, while he's arguing, he seems to be happy, so I'm happy to facilitate that.
It's been great talking to you, Amy.
And you, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thanks to my lovely guest, Amy Remeikis. If you enjoy this show, you can help support it by sharing it with your friends, family, colleagues, anyone in your life who enjoys discussing great Australian writing. You can find Penmanship online at penmanshippodcast.com and on Twitter at penmanshipau. If you've got an idea for a guest, an Australian writer, an editor, publisher, anyone who works within that business who you think I should speak with for this program, you can email me, Andrew at penmanshippodcast.com. That's it for now. Farewell.